Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us at the Brooklyn Book Festival. So cool you could make it. We have three wonderful novelists with us today on the panel. We have Lily King, Maisie Card, Zaina Arafat, and I'm gonna give each of those a proper introduction in a minute. First, thanks guys for being with us. I'm so excited to talk to you. Where are you all coming from? Because we're not in Brooklyn anymore. Where are you guys calling in from?
I'm in Newark, New Jersey.
Ah,
I'm in Portland, Maine.
okay.
Right now, I'm actually in Virginia, so
Oh, it's
yeah.
beautiful in Virginia. Look at
It
that.
is, isn't it? Heading back to Brooklyn though this afternoon. But, yeah.
All right, I'm so glad we could get together anyway. I'm just going to read your bios really quick to introduce you guys to the audience. We have Lily King. Lily is an award-winning author of the novels The Pleasing Hour, The English Teacher, Father of the Rain, and Euphoria, which was one of the New York Times Book Review's 10 best books of 2014, and a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and winner of the Kirkus Prize. Her most recent novel is Writers and Lovers, and she lives in Maine. Maisie Card is a writer and public librarian. Her writing has appeared in Lenny Letter, Guernica, Agni, Literary Hub, Sycamore Review, and other publications. Card was born in St. Catherine, Jamaica, but was raised in Jamaica, New York. Her debut novel, These Ghosts Are Family, was released in March. And Zaina Arafat is a queer Palestinian American writer and the author of the novel You Exist Too Much, an indie next pick for this June past, sorry. Her stories and essays have appeared in Granta, the New York Times, The Believer, VQR, Vice, BuzzFeed, The Atlantic, and NPR. She holds an MFA from the University of Iowa and was awarded the 2018 Arab Women Migrants from the Middle East Fellowship from Jack Jones Literary Arts, and she currently lives in Brooklyn. Thank you guys for being here. I guess we'll just we'll leave a moment for audience applause, and I guess we'll just go into it. Excuse me. I'd like to start with a question that relates to our theme today. These novels take us to many different settings geographically, but we can think about New Lands as not just a setting too, but also a state of mind. These novels take us from Kingston, Jamaica to Harlem in Maisie's novel, to the Middle East and Brooklyn in Zaina's, and Cambridge, where we find Lily King's narrator. And the characters of these books take us to even further destinations, in their own consciousness. So my question is, I'd like to ask you, could you each tell us? Oh, I'm sorry, I'm asking a question already. We're supposed to do the reading. I already
Start
screwed
with
it
that question and then read it.
up. All right, let's go to the reading. Why don't we start? And I'll ask that exact question again in a couple minutes. I did the same thing when I hosted the National Book Awards reading. I skipped people. I didn't give them chances to read. So this is what you get when I'm your host. Why don't we start with a short reading by Lily, and then we'll go to Maisie and then Zaina. Lily, why don't you show us some of the work? Yeah.
I'm going to read starting on page 11. I tried to find something to kind of fit in with this theme because really this novel takes place only in Massachusetts. It starts out, she works in Cambridge and she lives in Brookline, and it doesn't have a huge geographical span in that way. But my main character, Casey, is coming home to Massachusetts after being away and many different places. So right now we just see her on the street of Cambridge in Harvard Square, and she's walking to an old bookstore that she used to work at, and she's a mess, I'll just say, for many reasons. I walked to Salvador's Foreign Books on Mount Auburn Street. I worked there 6 years ago in 1991. After Paris and before Pennsylvania and Albuquerque and Oregon and Spain and Rhode Island, before Luke, before my mother went to Chile with 4 friends and was the one who didn't come back. I wasn't broke when I worked at Salvatore's, or at least I didn't think I was. My debts were much smaller, and Sally Mae and Ed Fund and Collection Technology and Citibank and Chase weren't hassling me yet. I sublet a room in a house on Chauncey Street with friends, $80 a month. We were all trying to be writers with jobs that got us by. Nia and Abby were working on novels. I was writing stories, and Russell was a poet. Of all of us, I would have bet that Russell would stick with it the longest. Rigid and disciplined, he got up at 4:30 every morning, wrote until 7, and ran 5 miles before he went to work at Widener Library. But he was the first to surrender and go to law school. He's a tax attorney in Tampa now. Abby was next. Her aunt convinced her to take a realtor's exam just on a lark. Later, she tried to tell me she was still using her imagination when she walked through the houses and invented a new life for her clients. I saw her last month outside an enormous house with white columns in Brookline. She was leaning into the driver's window of a black SUV in the driveway and nodding profusely. Nia met a Milton scholar with excellent posture and a trust fund who handed her novel back after reading 15 pages saying first-person female narratives grated on him. She chucked it in the dumpster, married him, and moved to Houston when he got a job at Rice. I didn't get it. I didn't get any of them back then. One by one, they gave up, moved out, and got replaced by engineers from MIT. A guy with a ponytail and a Spanish accent came into Salvatore's looking for Bars sur Racine. We spoke in French. He said he hated English. His French was better than mine. His father was from Algiers. He made me a Catalan fish stew in his room in Central Square. When he kissed me, he smelled like Europe. His fellowship ended and he went home to Barcelona. I went to an MFA program in Pennsylvania and we wrote each other love letters until I started dating the funny guy in workshop who wrote gloomy 2-page stories set in New Hampshire mill towns. After we broke up, I moved to Albuquerque for a while, then ended up in Bend, Oregon with Caleb and his boyfriend Phil. A letter from Paco found me there and we resumed our correspondence. Enclosed in his 5th letter to me was a one-way ticket to Barcelona. I poke around the ancient Greek section. That's the next language I want to learn. Around the corner in Italian, the only other customer sits cross-legged on the floor with a small boy, reading him Cuore. Her voice is low and beautiful. I started speaking a little Italian in Barcelona with my friend Julia. I come to the long wall of French literature, divided by publishers. Rows of red on ivory Gallimard, blue on white Édition de Minuit, dime store like Livre de Poche, and then the extravagant Pliade, set apart in their own glass case, leather bound with gold print and thin gold stripes. Balzac and Montaigne and Valéry, their spines glistening like jewels. I see a copy of Sur Racine, which we didn't have the day Paco came looking for it. I had to special order it for him. I touch a bit of the glue at the top of the spine. I don't ever cry about Paco. So she's been crying about this other guy, Luke, this whole novel so far, the first 11 pages. Those 2 years with him rest lightly on me. We went from French to a sort of hybrid of the Catalan and Castellano that he taught me. And I wonder if that's part of the reason I don't miss him, that everything we ever said to each other was in languages I'm starting to forget. Maybe the thrill of the relationship was the language, that everything was heightened for me because of it, more of a challenge, as I tried to maintain his belief in my facility with languages, my ability to absorb, mimic, morph. It was a trick no one expected of an American, the combination of a good ear, good memory, and an understanding of the rules of grammar, so that I appeared more of a prodigy than I was. Every conversation was a chance to excel, to frolic, to amuse myself, and to surprise him. And yet now I can't remember what we said to each other. Conversations in foreign languages don't linger in my head like they do in English. They don't last. They remind me of the invisible ink pen my mother sent me for Christmas when I was 15 and she had gone, an irony that escaped her, but not me. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Lily.
Thank you.
Another great thing about writers and lovers reading it, you get a whole reading list from because the character's a writer. I have a whole list here of things I want to read. Okay, let's go to Maisie.
Sure. I'm going to just read a little bit of the middle of chapter 1, which is actually set in Harlem, but references Jamaica. You have always sensed a lie behind your parents' words, have always suspected that their Jamaica was a place that did not exist. You have always wondered why they never chose, in all these years, to return to that island so perfect. Instead, it was always the right weapon to throw in your face, always the only answer to their problems, their main problem always being you. When you were younger, you would scream back at them that if in Jamaica the daughters were pure, saved themselves until marriage, stood by their mother's side every day in the kitchen and watched them cook, brought their father his slippers when he got home from the store, went to church every Sunday, never refused to recite the Lord's Prayer at the table before a meal, didn't proclaim themselves agnostics, wanted to be wives instead of artists, always agreed to stack canned food on the shelves of their father's store after school, didn't stand under the streetlights at night talking to boys from the block, did their own laundry and their father's too, did not jump between their parents and cuss their father out every time he raised his voice at their mother, did not promise to kill their father if he dared threaten, only threatened to one day slap their mother in the face. If in Jamaica, daughters did not run away from home and return pregnant by a man twice their age, did not go out partying instead of staying home with their newborn child, did not walk down the street in skirts so short they barely covered their pum-pum, did not make their mother cry and waste away with worry, never did drugs, and if they did, were never so weak that they would become addicted. If in Jamaica, daughters were churned out of factories without the slightest defect, why the fuck didn't they go back there and leave you alone? When your father tells you his secret, that he is not really Stanford Solomon, and therefore you in turn cannot be Estelle Solomon, that your family does not even exist, you will have your answer, and it is perfect. Thanks.
Thank you, Maisie. That was great. Can't wait to talk about your book. Let's go to our last reading by Zaina.
Okay, just a couple of pages from the beginning of the book, the very beginning. In Bethlehem, when I was 12, men in airy white gowns sat at a three-legged table outside the Church of the Nativity. They ran prayer beads through their fingers and sipped mint tea in gold-ribboned cups shaped like hourglasses, steam floating off the surface and up into the bright blue sky. I walked past them with my mother and my uncle as we wandered through the holy city. One of the men called out, "Haram," forbidden. For the especially devout among us, it's haram for a pubescent girl to expose her legs in a biblical city. It occurred to me then that I wasn't a flat-chested kid anymore, that curves had begun to appear along the length of me. I was no longer indistinguishable from a boy child. What should we do? I asked my mother. I felt a pulsing lump take shape in my throat as I noticed her jaw extended and temples shimmering. My great-grandparents' house was where we were staying and where all of my clothes were, 36 miles and 3 checkpoints away. I should have had more sense than to dress in such a way when we were visiting the birthplace of a prophet, albeit not our own. My mother had, and still has, a native's knowledge. She knows the rules instinctively in that part of the world, and I only ever learn them by accident. "Basita," said my uncle, "it's okay." We approached the main door of the church, and the men hissed again. My uncle ran the tips of his fingers across his mustache, then looked to my mother and me. "Come," he said, "I have an idea." We followed him into a gift shop just off Menger Square. He dropped a few coins on the counter, then asked the shopkeeper if we could use his bathroom. My uncle's master plan was that he would trade me his trousers for my Roxy Surfer shorts. He went into the bathroom first, and I could hear sounds of fumbling, his belt jangling as it hit the floor. He opened the door slightly and handed his pants to my mother so she could administer the swap. She then stood in front of me while I took off my shorts. "Yalla," she said, her most frequently used word. "Hurry." I pulled on the pair of pants. They sagged on me. I had to tighten the belt buckle all the way up to the last hole and then roll the waist so that they wouldn't fall off, leaving me even more exposed than I had been before. I stepped out of the bathroom and looked at my uncle. I examined my new curves against his pasty legs, gangly and covered in sporadic patches of hair, my shorts tight against his thighs. It occurred to me in that moment to question why, as a man, his bare legs were somehow less troubling than mine. It was a double standard, a shame I had simply accepted until then. In acquiring my gender, I had become offensive. But as I stood in front of him, an unexpected pride began to swell inside me. I liked the way his trousers made me feel, like I could get attention from boys, from girls. I felt, for once, seen. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Zaina. Thanks, guys. Okay, now I can ask my first question. I'd like to ask you, could you tell us a little bit about your characters, particularly your protagonists, and, thinking about our theme today, what do you think your characters are in search of? What are they in search of? We can start with Lily and just kind of go in the same order, or if you guys can pop in whenever you want to talk. Yeah. Why don't we start with Lily?
Okay. So my character is 31 years old, and she has arrived in Cambridge $70,000. Oh, sorry. Sorry. I meant to shut
That's
that
all
off.
right. That's all right. You're not the first.
It scared me. It was on so loud. She has come to Cambridge $70,000 in debt with a broken heart, and her mother has just died. And she's been carrying around a novel that she's been writing for 6 years. And I think her big quest is kind of a search for the rest of her life. I feel like she's kind of come to the very end of her youth, and the end of kind of winging it in a way, and all of her choices have kind of led her to this sort of difficult, penniless spot, and yet she's just not willing to compromise. Give up her dream. And so she's just really trying to get to the rest of her life. She's trying to figure out how she could be successful and not a failure in love and in writing, and and somehow make money.
Yeah. Oh, great. Awesome. Maisie, you have a kaleidoscope of very interesting characters in your book.
Yeah, so there's not really one main character, but yeah, the character who starts the story, Stanford Solomon, ends up confessing. He kind of wants to atone for faking his own death and taking on another man's name. And I think the other characters are they've all immigrated to America from Jamaica, or they were born in America, and they're kind of trying to process what happened in Jamaica that led them to where they are now. So I think most of them are like looking to have some kind of reckoning, or or to atone for the things they did. And yeah, like a lot of the people that they want the reckoning kind of with are dead. So they're kind of just thinking back and focusing on memories and having these kind of out of body or supernatural experiences, so they can kind of get that reckoning that they want.
Yeah. Thank you. Zaina, tell us about your characters.
I think that my characters, and particularly my protagonist, is in search of a sense of like belonging, really, because she's sort of caught in between like worlds, between cultures, between like identities in a way. She's searching for acceptance. She's queer and comes from a sort of conservative culture and family, searching for that validation to exist as she does, without apology. I think that other characters, particularly the mother, is searching for a sense of like understanding and being able to relate to, or at least understanding and relating to her daughter who feels so foreign to her. So I think that those are the ends that the characters are seeking to achieve.
Yeah, great. There's so much that's similar in these novels thematically, but they're also different, and there's so much that's so different. but there is a lot of heartbreak in these novels, is what I experienced. Whether it has to do with love or loss. Um, and whenever a book tends to move me, as all three of yours have this past month, I suspect that the work has to be deeply personal in some way. I get the sense that like a confession is being made. I got that feeling from all of your books, whether that's totally made up or not. I sense the author, you guys have left your blood, sweat, and tears on the page. Um, can you talk about what is personal to you in these stories? And not what's like true or autobiographical. Just what's personal in the novels that you've just written. We could start with anyone, but we could go to Lily as well. Oh, I'll just take you off mute. Take yourself off mute. I
Yeah,
can't.
sorry about that.
No.
I think the trick with a writing, especially a first person narrator or a close third, where you really want to get into their heads, like Maisie's. I think the real trick is to make it feel personal, and sometimes that means pulling things from your own life, but sometimes it means not at all pulling things from your sometimes if I write things that that are directly from my life, it feels flatter and not as real, because every novel has its own universe, it has its own laws, and you can't just like throw in things, they have to fit into that universe. And so you're always aiming for the semblance of truly intimate, and I think I think in this book, the personal thing to me was that that my mother had just died before I wrote this book. I was writing something completely different. My mother died very, very suddenly, and I couldn't write for about 9 months. And then when I started writing again, this sense of vulnerability was really like in my throat, like it really knocked me for a loop, her death. And I think it reverberated and kind of brought up inside me this other time in my life that was so difficult, which was, when I was in my late 20s and early 30s, so broke and just trying to kind of, magically become a writer, and really experiencing a lot of blows with that. And so those emotions, there are a lot, so much of it is made up, but the emotions of it are what I was really trying to capture in this book. So that's, and I also just needed a place for my emotions about dealing with the loss of my mother. I needed a receptacle, and I think that's a lot of the reason why I wrote this book too.
Yeah. Okay. Maisie, what's personal to you about the stories in your novel?
I said something similar to what Lily just said too. It's the circumstances in the book aren't real, but the emotions are real. And I think it's like everybody has things that they can't say to their family. So I think it started from me thinking about that frustration and having all these things that I want to say, but I know that we'll never talk about it, we'll never say. So I think what was personal was just like me trying to imagine characters that were either having like a real confrontation with their family, or just like an imaginary, or like using magical realism, having this confrontation with somebody who died, who you couldn't really have say certain things to when they were alive.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's what fiction can do, right? um Zaina, what's personal to you about your novel? Oh, you're on mute.
I just got a little notice. So I would say, that what's personal to me about the novel is some of the larger like thematic elements, like that sense of of trying to connect with well, the experience of like being first generation, I suppose, and having immigrant parents, and coming from an immigrant background, and how it is that one relates to that immigrant generation, and how that immigrant generation relates to the first generation, and how the first generation kind of relates to the homeland of the parents, and to what degree do they identify with that versus their adopted home or their parents adopted homeland, right? And so all of that to me is where the, I don't know, what feels personal, along with the like um the kind of, I would say, existing in spaces that are deemed in ways unacceptable in certain, in certain contexts, and sometimes those spaces are deemed unacceptable by oneself. Like doesn't necessarily feel one doesn't necessarily feel comfortable embodying, themselves as queer, or as, female, or as like any of these different ways that a person can be. And so I think all of that, just like that struggle to embody overlapping and sometimes like messy identities that are not necessarily like status quo acceptable, I guess, is what it feels personal to me. It's an interesting question, because like isn't a whole, like no matter what degree of fiction a novel is, I mean, if you write a novel, like the ideas are coming from your head, so like isn't it, I always think about that, like it's so hard to say something is, even if something isn't autobiographical at all, like there must be a personal element. Otherwise, why the hell would you be doing this, right? Because like it's so hard and painful sometimes. There must be something personal that you need to like, or that like, or at least for me, it's like there's always something personal that I want to work out in some way, even if it's through like these fake people, and fake scenarios. So
Yeah, that's so true. And when you say, I know every sentence in your novels, you guys, is personal. Absolutely. I guess I was like wondering like what's most personal, because I've been
no,
reading.
it's a great question, because it makes me think about that. I'm like, well, what, like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like, gosh, isn't all of it, but none of it, but some of it, like it's so, I think that's why, sorry to totally cut you off, but that's what I love about reading, I guess, is that like it's so intimate, because like you connect with another person's like personal inner world, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And what was I gonna say? Oh, it's just slipped my mind, but yeah, absolutely.
I got excited.
No, that's fine. Let me go to, this will be my last question, and then we're going to open it up to the audience Q&A. We got some questions building up here. My last question for you guys is this. Every time we write a book, we're trying to make something in the tradition of the books we love, but we're also trying to break new ground, discover new lands and territories. So my question is, what sort of new ground or territories were you trying to discover with your novels? That might be, I'm not sure if that's a hard question or easy for you. So what sort of new ground or territories were you trying to discover with these books? I know, Lily, this is your 5th novel, and Zaina and Maisie, these are both your debut novels. Lily?
Let's see. I never know where I'm going, what I'm going for, what I have to say about these characters. When I start a book, I just have a situation in mind, and usually I have, the idea for a main character and kind of her emotional state, and then sort of a small sense of the emotional arc that I want her to go on. But I don't set out. But then, many drafts later, you're like, oh, this is the new territory I wanted to discover, and I didn't even know it. I think one of the things that really surprised, I mean, there's a lot, in all of our books, there's a lot going on. And so I think that there are a number of them, but one thing I can definitely say is I didn't know until I started writing how much I had to say about the patriarchy. you know, I'm not, I usually save that kind of stuff for nonfiction. And it was really surprising to me um, how how informed my life as a young unpublished writer was informed by the patriarchy in the 90s and what was going on, and just how um, uh, just kind of the stranglehold that men had on the publishing industry, white men had on the publishing industry at that time, and and how young male writers responded to that. And you know, uh, I didn't even realize when I was writing it how much there was of that. Uh, but my readers have pointed it out over and over. Not in a bad way for the most part. Although there have been a few men, you know, who are like, "Wow, she just hates men, and every man in this book is horrible." And I'm like, "No, no. What about blah 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 blah?" But yeah. So I was. I mean, I think all of my books are feminist, but this was there are a lot of really uh, um, kind of strategic hits in this one.
Yeah, I totally see that, and you know, I think the patriarchy of the publishing industry. I mean, it relates to when I got in the business as well. It was sort of like, you know, in the late aughts. So it's something that so many readers, even now writers too, can connect with, I think. Um, let's go to Maisie. What sort of new ground were you trying to discover with this novel?
You know, I don't know if it's new ground. I guess, you know, I came to America as an immigrant, but I was like a child immigrant, and you know, I think my first like 13 years or 12 years, you know, I grew up in a part of Queens that was like everybody in my neighborhood was basically an immigrant, or and all the people were West Indian. So I wasn't really conscious of identity because nobody was really like American. But I think it's like I moved up through like academia, you know, the spaces got progressively whiter, you know, and I was always like the minority. And I think you're not really taught to like protect your culture or your identity. And so I think after I finished, or when I started graduate school, I kind of realized that I wasn't like as Jamaican anymore, I guess. So I think this is when I was writing it, I was trying to kind of explore like how much I still fit into that space, I guess, like, and like what kind of memories I still retained. You know, how much of the culture do I still understand, you know, because I feel like you know, I kind of started to doubt myself, and it was like hard writing the novel because you're always worried about like authenticity. You know, so I think for me it was just kind of like rediscovering like a part of myself I hadn't thought about, or I hadn't been conscious of for a really long time.
Yeah, well, that's great. That's great. Um, yeah, the writing process can do that. Amazing. Zaina, what new ground were you trying to discover with?
Well, I think what I was trying to do was, I don't know if this counts as if this fits exactly, but like I wanted to see like an Arab character portrayed in a way that I hadn't seen before, like outside of stereotypical sort of images and associations that often come with like Arabs, and also especially Arab women as like oppressed or, you know, repressed. And so it was really important to me to create a character that like didn't like have to defy that very loudly, but like just existed in a different way than we traditionally, than like, you know, maybe Western, than are depicted in Western media. And I felt like fiction was a great way to do that because it doesn't have to be like, it doesn't have to be telling you like, hey, you should change your views on like, you're like open your mind in terms of how Arab women can exist, but it kind of does so subversively. And so that was something I was really, and that's I think that that's why I started writing in the first place, like as a back in whatever the aughts, like as a journalist, was because of all the sort of misrepresentations of Arabs in the media. And I found that journalism could only take you so far because people kind of resist sometimes when it was just so much more like subversive to write fictionally and create characters that defied those categories and stereotypes. So that's what I was trying to do.
Yeah, in a sense, like write the book that you feel doesn't exist yet, and I feel like that's what I felt that feeling with all of these books. Absolutely. Let's now, for the remainder of the program, let's go to the audience Q&A, and I'm just gonna read some of their questions, and you guys can now start asking questions like mad if you want, and I'll do my best. The first one is from Layla, and she has a question for Miss Arafat. Do you feel the pressure to represent Palestine in your writing? And how does the pressure affect your writing? Do you feel that pressure?
So I don't, it's a natural pressure. Like I find that everything I write in some way, is about Palestine, relates to Palestine. In this book, obviously there's a lot of Palestine on both a like sort of abstract and concrete level. And I do feel that pressure like from within in a way, or just something I continue to circle around. And what was the second part of the question?
Second part of the question was, how does the pressure affect your writing?
Right. I mean, at first I found it like, I found that if I tried to, it affects my initially it was hard to write about anything else in some way. But eventually, I think as I sort of built my, I don't know, as I gained more experience writing, I was able to write about things that were maybe less like specifically related to Palestine, but maybe related to like, things that were related to Palestine or like similar to the Palestinian experience in some way. And then sometimes things that had absolutely nothing to do with anything related to Palestine or the Palestinian experience. So began with a sort of inner pressure and then eventually expanded outwards in different directions.
Yeah. I'll expand that question to others too. Like, did you guys feel the pressure of your own community while you were gonna write this? For Maisie, maybe that's about Jamaican people, Jamaican immigrants. Lily, maybe that's like writers with MFAs writing their first novel. Maisie.
Yeah, no, I would say I did, but I feel like I'm just neurotic, so I think about all the criticism that I'm going to receive. But yeah, so I think especially because, I didn't grow up there. I wasn't, I didn't go to school for a long time there. So I was worried about like how it would be received by actual Jamaican people who have lived there. But yeah, it's actually been received really well. But yeah, that was something I was very self-conscious about.
Good. Lily, do you feel that you're on your this was your fifth novel?
Yeah, I definitely with this one. I mean, I can't let myself think about how people will respond to my novels, especially people who, may have had similar experiences to the main character. I mean, when I was writing Euphoria, I'd never even taken an anthropology class, and I couldn't bear to think about anthropologists and what they might think about that novel. And this one, I the idea that writers would read it and would obviously have had different experiences, and I didn't feel any, it's not the same. I didn't feel any pressure that I had to, or I don't know. I don't often feel like I choose my time. It just chooses me. And it's not like I wanted to write about writers. It
Right.
just happened.
Yeah, that's the way it is sometimes.
But I was nervous about that particular thing because of course, writers read and they might read my book.
Yeah. Well, you nailed it, because I spent 2 years in Cambridge when I was living there writing my first novel, and I was doing it at the MIT library. So I totally related to every scene, and then all the stuff at the Plow and the Stars and Harvard Square. I loved it. Yeah, totally nailed it. Okay, let's see if we have another question. Audience, what do you got? Okay. Can you guys share with us some of the process of writing these particular books, their evolution. I'll add to that. How did they start? Was this the first thing you sat down to write and it all worked out? I'm sure that's not the case. Let's go with, I'll just choose another order. How about Zaina?
Sure. The process of writing this, well, it began with a question around unattainability. And I was just thinking about creating a character who set her sights on unattainable things, unattainable women in this case. And then from there, I started to think about unattainable in a more thematic way and how that related to her as a Palestinian, and how Palestinian statehood and self-determination, these are also unattainable things. And so, I just kept circling around that question. And as I did that, as I kept that question in my mind, I kind of created the different layers of the book, and then taped the pages to the wall and tried to make them all fit together and see how they could speak to one another, because it seemed that they did speak to one another. And that was, honestly, like much of the process was structuring the book, and fitting together the sort of micro level of the love stories and the macro level of like culture and home and one's political sort of reality. So that was the process.
Cool. Maisie, what was the
Uh,
evolution of yours?
Yeah, it took a really long time. It took me a really long time to know what I was writing. I started it in 2006 when I was in an MFA program. So it took me about 12 years. And it started out as like non-linked, non-connected short stories. And actually, for some of the early stories that I wrote, I took parts of like creative nonfiction essays that I'd written in college. And so they were starting from these like early memories, and then I think like took like 6 or 7 years of writing it before I realized that, I'm really writing about one family. And so I changed everything so that everything was connected. And I had it, I organized it around a single main character and, his secret. So it kind of evolved from, short stories, linked short stories to like the novel in stories that it is, that it is now over 12 years.
Oh, wow, I never would have guessed that. I thought you did such a good job of like you leap through different, to different time periods. One chapter will be in the 60s, the next is like 2011. And so that was really successful.
Yeah,
Lily, can you tell us about yours?
sure. I wouldn't have guessed that either. I just want to say to the audience that Maisie and Zaina's books are so good, and I really, really hope you go run out and get them. They are such strong debuts, both of them, and I get why they were chosen for this festival, because they're really powerful right from the beginning. So I just want to say that first, and then like I said, I was working on something else. I did a ton of research for one book, and then that didn't work out, and then I did a ton of research for another book, and I got about 21 pages in, and then, as I said, my mom died very suddenly, very far away, no goodbyes or anything like that, and so I couldn't even open the notebook of that last book that I was writing, and I just wrote in my journal for months, and then when I started writing, as I said, this book really just kind of came out of me very quickly. What always happens to me is 2/3 of the way through, I say I can't do it. Like everything. I don't know if you all have the same thing. There's a moment, where you feel like you can't go on. But for me, it's always 2/3 of the way through. And I've kind of gotten through a lot of the meat of the book, and I can't. And it's like you've set certain traps for yourself, and you just can't get out. It just feels like a bunch of knots and not anything that you're ever going to be able to untie. It always happens to me, and I always tell my husband that I cannot do this one. I just cannot do it. I'm gonna have to give up. And I've never given up, knock on wood, at that really late stage. And he's always like, you always say that. And I'm like, no, this time it really, really, really is different. And he's like, you always say that too. Get back up there. And so so somehow I found my way through to the end. But but that's always the hardest part. But and I think, yeah, it's my fifth book, but really every book is its own Rubik's cube. It doesn't. The only thing that gets easier is that a little bit more not to listen to all the negative voices that come at you all day long, and just like, okay, yeah, it's crap, I know that voice, and you just kind of push through and ignore it. And that particular one, the 2/3 of the way one, that's a really hard voice to ignore. But I'm really hoping next time I'll ignore that one too.
Yeah. Okay. That's awesome. That's all the time we have. Thanks so much, guys, for joining us, writing these fabulous novels. You guys are brilliant. I congratulate you on all your success. And thanks to the audience for these questions. So yeah, that's a wrap. Thanks, guys.
Thank you all. Thanks so much. Thanks, Alex. And thank you, Lily and Maisy. It's been great to be here with you guys. So thanks.
Really fun. Thank
And
you so
thanks to the
much.
audience. Yeah, really fun.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.